We're keeping it small this year. That was all my mother said. No hesitation, no apology, just those 5 words sliding through the phone like a cold blade. They thought leaving me out would silence me, but my revenge spoke louder than they ever imagined. Watch this story until the end, you won't forget it. I sat at the kitchen counter, the cordless phone pressed against my ear, the smell of burnt coffee curling up from the pot I had forgotten to turn off. My hand didn't shake. My voice didn't break. Instead, I took a slow breath, glanced at the clock glowing 7:14 p.m. and whispered back, "I see." She thought I'd protest. She thought I'd beg for my place at the table I'd spent 40 years setting, cleaning, cooking for. But I didn't. Not this time. "Just us," she added quickly as if that softened the cut. "Your brother, his wife, the grandkids. Nothing fancy. Just simple. Simple." I let the word hang between us, heavy and sour. The same simple she had used last year when I was asked to bring dessert but not sit at the main table. The same simple that always meant without you. "Of course," I said, my tone so even it startled even me. "Keep it small." I could almost hear her relief, a breath slipping through the receiver. "I knew you'd understand." "Understand?" Oh, I understood plenty. The line went dead. I placed the phone gently on the counter, though every muscle in my arm ached to slam it down until the plastic cracked. I stood there in the dim light of the kitchen, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the distant muffled laugh track of a sitcom bleeding through the wall from the neighbor's TV. It was all too ordinary for the moment my family had decided I no longer belonged. I walked to the window above the sink. Outside, the November night pressed close, the yard bare and skeletal under the glow of the porch light. The air smelled of wet leaves, faintly metallic, the kind of scent that lingers after a rain. Across the street, Mrs. Turner had already put out her Thanksgiving decorations. A fake turkey centerpiece glowing orange and gold in her front window, 2 plastic pilgrims on the porch. I wondered if her children were invited. I wondered if they knew how lucky they were to still have a place. I moved back to the counter and saw it lying there, half covered by yesterday's mail, the leather-bound guest book. My hand hovered above it, my fingertips brushing the cracked spine. It wasn't meant for family. It wasn't meant for tradition. It was mine. Every time someone visited me, a neighbor, an old coworker, the women from church who stopped by with casseroles when I was sick, I asked them to sign it. Not out of formality but out of stubbornness. If my family wouldn't count me, I would count myself. I flipped it open. The first name jumped at me. Carla, 2014, you make the best coffee cake. I smiled faintly. My chest didn't ache as much when I read the words. I turned the pages slowly, listening to the crisp whisper of paper. Dozens of names stared back at me, some fading, some recent, each one proof that I wasn't as forgotten as they wanted me to believe. My mother didn't know about this book. No one in the family did. And as I looked at those names, I realized I had something they had never taken from me. The phone rang again, sharp and sudden, cutting through my thoughts. I picked it up before the second ring. It was my sister-in-law. "Oh, hi," she said, her voice sugary but brittle. "Just wanted to check if Mom talked to you. About Thanksgiving." "Yes," I said flatly. "Oh, good. I mean, you understand, right? With the kids and, trying to keep it less complicated." "Less complicated." Another knife wrapped in politeness. "Of course," I repeated, my voice calm, deliberate. "Well, we'll miss you." She didn't mean it. Her tone was almost gleeful, like a child bragging about a secret she got to keep. "Enjoy your dinner," I said, and hung up before she could gloat further. I stood still for a moment, the quiet pressing harder than before. My pulse slowed. I walked to the kitchen table, pulled out the chair and sat down. If they thought they had silenced me, they were wrong. The next morning I went about my routine as though nothing had changed. That was the beauty of betrayal. You could either crumble under it or fold it neatly and tuck it away until the right moment. I made my bed, fed the cat, and poured myself tea instead of coffee, letting the steam rise in soft spirals. The house felt colder than usual. I wrapped a cardigan around my shoulders and looked at the calendar pinned on the fridge. Thanksgiving was circled in red ink, a habit I hadn't broken even when the invitations started coming later, smaller, less warm. This year there would be no circle for me. But as I sipped my tea, I realized I didn't feel as empty as they hoped. Instead, a new kind of warmth settled into me, steady, deliberate, almost dangerous. That afternoon I ran errands. The grocery store was packed with families shopping for turkeys, pies, stuffing. I walked past them slowly, cart empty, listening to their chatter about recipes and traditions. A woman brushed past me, her arms full of sweet potatoes. Big family this year, she laughed to her friend. Almost laughed too. Big family. Small family. No family. What difference did it make when your own blood cut you out? But I wasn't alone. Not really. I had the names in that guest book. I had neighbors who waved when I pulled into the driveway. I had the women at church who always saved me a seat. I had colleagues who still sent me cards every Christmas. And maybe, just maybe, I had something even stronger than all of that. A plan. That night I cooked dinner for myself. A small roast chicken, carrots and potatoes. Nothing fancy. Nothing worth showing off. But as I sat at the table, the clock ticking toward 9 p.m., I found myself staring at the empty chairs around me. For years those chairs had been filled. My husband before he passed, my children before they moved away, friends who came and went. Now the silence was louder than laughter had ever been. I set down my fork and whispered into the quiet, "They think I need them." The words didn't sound bitter. They sounded true. I pushed my plate away, stood up and walked back to the counter where the guest book still lay open. My fingers traced over the most recent signature. Rachel, last week. You always know how to make a house feel warm. Warm? Yes. I knew how. And I would again. The next day I passed my neighbor on the sidewalk. "Big plans for Thanksgiving?" she asked kindly. I smiled, my lips curling with a secret I wasn't ready to share. "Oh, I'll be keeping it small." She nodded and walked on, not knowing that in my mind, the wheels had already begun to turn. Because my family thought they could erase me with a few words. But I knew something they didn't. I still had a table. And soon it would be fuller than theirs could ever be. That thought carried me through the night. I slept lightly, the kind of sleep where dreams blur with waking, and every time I opened my eyes, I saw the empty chairs in my dining room. But instead of sadness, I felt something else growing inside me. Steady, strong, almost electric. By morning I knew what I had to do. I pulled the heavy curtains open and let the gray November light spill into the room. The sky outside was low and heavy, the kind of sky that promised a holiday storm. My breath fogged against the cold window as I looked out over the yard. Bare trees stood like watchmen, their branches rattling in the wind. For the first time in years I didn't feel small beneath them. I turned back to my dining room table, long sturdy oak, scratched and worn in places but still mine. I ran my hand across the surface, tracing the grooves I'd polished for decades. How many meals had I served here? Birthdays, anniversaries, Sunday dinners. They had tried to erase me from theirs, but this table still waited for me, loyal and silent. Only this year it would not sit empty. I started with the guest book. I carried it to the table, sat down and opened it to the first page. Names leapt at me. Neighbors, church friends, even my mailman had scribbled his thanks one Christmas when I'd left him a tin of cookies. Each name felt like a lantern in the dark. I made a list. 32 names. People who had cared enough to leave a note, a smile, a memory. People who might just come if I asked. The phone sat on the counter waiting. I stared at it for a long time before I picked it up. My fingers hesitated over the keypad, but then I dialed the first number. "Hello." Carla's voice was warm, surprised. "Carla," I said softly, "I'm hosting Thanksgiving at my place this year. Nothing fancy. Just my own table. I'd love for you to come." There was a pause. Then laughter, bright and genuine. "Are you kidding? I'd be honored. What can I bring?" I smiled. The first yes was always the hardest. By the time I hung up after the 10th call, my list was halfway filled with names circled in ink. Each voice I reached out to carried the same tone. Surprise first, then excitement, as if they'd been waiting for me to claim my place. The days leading up to Thanksgiving blurred into a flurry of motion. I dug out recipes I hadn't touched in years, not the plain dishes my mother always insisted on, but the ones I loved. Spiced apple cider, sweet potato casserole with a pecan crust, a roast turkey stuffed with herbs from my own garden. The house filled with smells of cinnamon, garlic, and sage as I cooked and froze dishes ahead of time. My hands ached from kneading dough, but it was a sweet ache, the kind that reminded me of old strength returning. One afternoon, as I carried bags in from the store, my neighbor Mrs. Turner waved from across the street. "Big holiday plans?" she called, her scarf whipping in the wind. I smiled, my secret growing bolder. "Oh yes. A full house this year. She tilted her head curiously, but I didn't explain. Not yet. Let the surprise come on its own. By Thanksgiving morning, my kitchen was alive with sound and heat. Pots clattered, the oven hummed, and the air was thick with the perfume of roasting turkey. I wore my old apron, faded with stains, tied tight around my waist like armor. At 2 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. My heart skipped, but I wiped my hands and opened the door. Carla stood there holding a pie. Behind her came her husband, carrying a bottle of wine. "Happy Thanksgiving," she said, her smile wide. I stepped aside, my throat tightening. "Come in. You're the first. But not the last." By 3, the driveway was lined with cars. Guests carried dishes, gifts, flowers. My living room filled with laughter, coats piled on chairs, voices rising and overlapping until the house itself seemed to breathe again. I stood in the doorway, taking it all in. Every seat at the table was filled, 32 strong, and still people squeezed in wherever they could. The oak table groaned under the weight of food, the candles flickered, and the clink of silverware was like music. At one point, as I poured cider into glasses, a guest leaned close. "This is wonderful. I didn't know you hosted." I smiled faintly, eyes flicking toward the guest book now lying open on the sideboard, ready for new signatures. "It's the first time," I said. "But not the last." Inside, a quiet satisfaction burned. My family thought I would spend the day alone, forgotten. Instead, I had built something larger, louder, and stronger than they could ever have imagined. I glanced at the clock. 5:12 p.m. By now, they would be sitting at my mother's table, her perfect little small dinner, no doubt proud of themselves for cutting me out. Did they know? Did they feel it, the weight of what they had done? I hope so. Because here in my house, with 32 voices filling the air, I didn't just have dinner. I had proof. Proof that I was never as small as they tried to make me. The evening stretched on, warm and alive. Children played in the hallway, their laughter bouncing off the walls. Someone pulled out a guitar, strumming softly as others hummed along. I sat at the head of the table, my plate still full, unable to eat for the swell in my chest. For a moment, I let my gaze wander across the faces. Not blood, not family in the traditional sense, but real. People who showed up. People who said yes. And as the candles burned lower, I felt the quiet weight of something I hadn't felt in years. Belonging. But beneath it all, beneath the laughter and warmth, there was still a sharper edge. My mother's words still echoed. "We're keeping it small this year." Oh, she had no idea just how big I had made it. Later, when the last guests drifted out into the night, the house settled into silence again. But it wasn't the same silence as before. The table was cluttered with empty glasses and crumpled napkins, the faint scent of food lingering in the air. My hands smelled of garlic and pie crust. I picked up the guest book. 32 new signatures sprawled across the pages, each one proof of what had happened here. Proof I had not been erased. Proof I had won. I closed it gently, holding it to my chest. My phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up, my breath catching when I saw the name on the screen. My mother. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, my reflection staring back at me in the darkened window above the sink. Finally, I pressed answer. Her voice was tight, brittle. "We saw the photos." I said nothing. The silence stretched, waited, until she spoke again, sharper this time. "You embarrassed us." A slow smile crept across my face. "Did I?" I said softly. And before she could reply, I hung up. The phone clicked silent in my hand. For a moment I just stood there, staring at the black screen, my reflection faint in the glass. My own smile looked strange, unfamiliar. Not cruel, but not kind either. It was the smile of a woman who finally realized she could hurt back without lifting a hand. I set the phone down on the counter. The house still smelled of roasted turkey and pie crust, the air warm and heavy with memory. But there was something else now too, the faint electric buzz of my phone vibrating again. Another call. Then another. Texts began to roll in, the screen lighting up like a beacon in the dark kitchen. Curiosity one. I picked it up. The first message was from a woman at church. "Saw the photos online. Your dinner looked beautiful. I had no idea you were hosting." Another pinged. "Your table looked amazing. You outdid yourself." I frowned, swiping open the screen. My heart gave a startled jump. There they were. Pictures from last night. My table glowing with candlelight, 32 faces smiling around it, dishes spread wide. Someone had posted them on Facebook tagging me. By morning the photos had spread. Friends shared them, neighbors commented, even distant acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years were chiming in. And with each new comment, each little heart icon, my own pulse steadied. The photos were everywhere. By mid-morning I couldn't keep up with the notifications. The church group thread was buzzing. Old coworkers left messages I hadn't expected. Even my mailman commented, joking about wanting an invite next year. I should have felt embarrassed. I should have worried about attention, about gossip. But instead I felt taller somehow, like the weight pressing on my chest had been lifted just enough for me to breathe again. I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the endless stream. The glow of the phone screen lit my face, but it was the comments that burned deeper. What a beautiful home. So many guests. How did you manage? You've always had the biggest heart. They didn't see the betrayal. They didn't know what my family had done. But they saw me. For the first time in years they really saw me. At noon the phone rang again. I didn't need to check the screen this time. I knew who it was. My mother. I answered, my voice even. Her words came fast, sharp like arrows. What were you thinking? Do you realize what you've done? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the streaks of sunlight breaking through the blinds. I made dinner, I said calmly. You humiliated us, she snapped. The whole family is talking about it. People are calling, asking why you weren't with us. Why you threw some spectacle instead. I let her rant. I listened to every word, letting them wash over me like cold water. When she finally paused, breathless, I spoke softly. Funny, isn't it? I didn't even need an invitation. People came anyway. There was silence on the other end. Then a sharp intake of breath. You embarrassed us, she repeated. Her voice cracked this time, thinner, weaker. I don't think so, I whispered. And I hung up again. The rest of the day moved strangely, as if time bent around me. I cleaned dishes, wiped counters, folded napkins still warm with the smell of cider. But all the while the notifications buzzed. By evening the photos had spread beyond my circle. A local community page shared them with the caption, "Look at this beautiful Thanksgiving gathering hosted by one of our own." Hundreds of people had liked it, dozens commented, and a few even messaged me privately, asking how I'd managed such a feast. Every ping of the phone was a reminder, not of my loneliness but of my reach. My family had tried to shrink me into silence, but the photos shouted louder than I ever could. The next morning I bundled myself in a coat and walked down the street to get some fresh air. The cold air bit at my cheeks, sharp and bracing. Leaves crunched under my boots, brittle and thin. As I passed Mrs. Turner's house, she opened her door, waving cheerfully. Well, look at you. The whole town's talking about that dinner of yours. 32 guests. You're famous. I laughed, though a part of me still trembled at her words. I don't know about famous. Oh, don't be modest, she said. That was something special. You showed everyone what real hospitality looks like. I thanked her and kept walking, but her words followed me like footprints. You showed everyone. Yes, I had. When I returned home, another message waited, this time from my cousin. She rarely called me, always too busy, too distant. The text was short. What was that all about? You trying to make us look bad? I stared at the words for a long moment. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, tempted to reply. But instead I set the phone down. Not every message needed an answer. Some accusations answered themselves. By evening the weight of what I'd done began to sink in. I sat in my armchair by the window, a blanket pulled over my knees, the guest book resting in my lap. 32 fresh signatures filled its pages now. 32 witnesses to the night my silence ended. I ran my fingers over the ink, the names still sharp. The paper slightly smudged in places where wine glasses had sweated onto the surface. It wasn't perfect. None of it was perfect. But it was real. The sound of my family's laughter from years past tried to creep into my memory, but I pushed it aside. Their table had no place for me. Mine had more than enough. That night I dreamed of tables. My mother's, small, polished, crowded with faces that never looked my way. And mine, long, loud, overflowing with food and laughter. The two tables stood side by side, one shrinking, the other stretching longer and longer until it disappeared into the horizon. When I woke, the dream clung to me like fog. But instead of fear, it brought clarity. The photos weren't just pictures. They were proof. Proof that I was not erased. Proof that I had built something they couldn't ignore. The phone rang again the next afternoon. This time it was my brother. "What were you thinking?" he demanded the moment I answered. His voice was clipped, angry, the kind of tone he used when he wanted control. "I was thinking of having a nice Thanksgiving," I replied. "You made us look like fools," he snapped. "Mom's furious. Everyone's asking why you weren't with us. Why you had to go make a show out of it." I leaned back, looking at the faint scratches on the dining table, scars from years of meals, arguments and laughter. "Funny," I said, "I didn't hear anyone calling me a fool." He sputtered something I didn't quite catch, then hung up without another word. I set the phone down and let the silence settle. They were angry. Because the photos they couldn't escape told a story they didn't want anyone else to see. That I didn't need them. And for the first time in years I didn't feel the need to prove myself to them anymore. The photos had already done it for me. But the real weight of those photos, the reach they carried, the echoes they left behind, was only just beginning to show. By Monday morning the phone calls and messages weren't just from friends and neighbors anymore. They came from corners I hadn't expected. People who usually never noticed me, voices that carried too much curiosity to ignore. And with each one I saw it more clearly. My family hadn't just tried to erase me. They'd underestimated me. I was standing in the grocery store when it happened the first time. The air smelled faintly of oranges stacked high in their bins, the squeak of carts filling the aisles. I'd stopped to pick out cranberries when two women from town approached me, their voices too bright, too careful. "Your dinner looked wonderful," one of them said, her eyes flicking over my coat, my shoes as though searching for clues. I nodded, smiling faintly. "It was." The other leaned closer. "Your table, 30-something guests, wasn't it?" I hesitated, pretending to think. 32. They exchanged a look. Not judgment, not quite admiration either. Something sharper, something nosier. And I knew then that the photos weren't just pictures anymore. They were ammunition. By the time I reached the checkout, I overheard another voice whisper behind me, "Why wasn't she with her family?" That night as I set down the grocery bags, the phone buzzed again. This time it was my brother's wife. She didn't bother with greetings. "You're causing trouble," she said, her tone tight. I pulled off my gloves slowly, hanging them by the door. "I'm not sure what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean," she snapped. "Everyone's talking. They're asking questions. About us. About why you weren't invited." Her words hung in the air. Why you weren't invited. Not why you didn't come. Not why you had your own plans. No, why they had cut me out. I let the silence stretch before answering. "Maybe the truth makes people uncomfortable. You embarrassed us." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "You made us look cruel." I almost laughed. Almost. "Instead," I said softly, "I didn't make you look that way." And I ended the call. The fallout spread further than I imagined. By Wednesday I got a call from an old coworker I hadn't spoken to in years. "I saw the photos," she said cheerfully. "You always did know how to bring people together. But your family wasn't there." Her voice dipped on the last question, hesitant but curious. "No," I said. "They kept it small." She exhaled sharply. "Well, looks like you didn't." We both laughed, but there was weight in her words, an understanding unspoken between women who had carried too many exclusions, too many quiet cuts over the years. The whispers weren't limited to town or old friends. They reached places my family hadn't expected. My cousin, who worked in a nearby office, called me one evening, his voice tight with something between irritation and disbelief. "Do you know what happened at work today?" he asked. "No," I said calmly, though my stomach tightened. "My boss asked me about you. About those pictures. Said he wished his wife could pull off something like that. Then he asked why I wasn't there. Why the family wasn't included." I stayed silent, letting his words unravel. "You've stirred things up," he said bitterly. "Or maybe," I replied softly, "the truth stirred itself." He muttered something under his breath and hung up. The cracks in their image widened faster than I had ever dreamed. At church that Sunday I caught sight of my mother across the aisle. She avoided my eyes, her lips pressed tight, but the whispers around us weren't kind. Why would she leave her daughter out? I heard one woman murmur. 32 guests, another whispered, and not one family member among them? What does that tell you? The words wrapped around my mother like smoke and I watched her stiffen under them. For once, it wasn't me shrinking in the shadows. It was her. Later that week, my neighbor's teenage daughter stopped me by the mailbox. "Your dinner looked amazing," she said shyly. My mom said it was the kind of Thanksgiving she wished we'd had. I smiled, though my heart twisted. The kind she wished we'd had. The fallout wasn't just whispers and gossip. It was reflection. People saw my table and began to measure their own. Some admired, some envied, some judged, but all of them noticed. And that was something my family could never undo. So I wasn't naive. I knew this attention came with its own cost. By Thursday, a letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, sharp, unmistakably my mother's scrawl. "You've hurt us. This family has always valued discretion and you've thrown it away for show. We are not spectacle. We are private. You need to think carefully about what you've done." I read it once, twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it inside the guest book. It belonged there among the names and signatures that proved I wasn't alone. But she was wrong. I hadn't made a spectacle. I had made a statement. But the real fallout came quietly in ways I didn't expect. The following Sunday, my brother's wife called again, this time her voice less sharp, more uncertain. "Mom's upset," she said. "She feels judged. She says you planned this to make her look bad." I stirred sugar into my tea, watching the crystals dissolve. Did she ever think leaving me out made me look bad? There was silence. Then a soft sigh. She didn't think it through. I let the words hang. For once, it wasn't me defending them. It was them defending themselves. That night, I sat alone in my dining room again, the guest book open in front of me. The pages were full now, 32 names written just days ago, layered over years of smaller notes. Proof of every time I had been seen, welcomed, remembered. The table in front of me was quiet again, the chairs empty. But the silence no longer stung. Instead, it hummed with possibility, with the weight of what had already shifted. Because for once, the fallout wasn't mine to carry. It was theirs. And I knew deep down they weren't ready for what was still coming. A week later, the envelope arrived. Thick, cream-colored, with my mother's handwriting across the front. No return address was needed. Her script was sharp enough to cut. Inside the card was simple. A holiday invitation. Christmas dinner, 6 p.m. My name was written neatly on the line beneath. For years I had begged for that space. For years I'd waited to be included. Now the paper trembled in my hand, not because I feared being left out, but because I realized I didn't need it anymore. I set the card on the counter and stared at it. My heart didn't ache. My stomach didn't twist. Instead, I laughed quietly to myself. They hadn't invited me out of love. They had invited me out of fear. On Christmas Eve, I dressed deliberately. A simple navy dress, pearls at my neck. Nothing flashy but nothing apologetic either. I slipped the guest book into my purse. Not for them, but for me. A reminder of what I carried, of the names that stood with me even when family had not. The night was cold, snow pressed against the sidewalks in soft piles, the air sharp in my lungs. Their house glowed warm from the street, strings of lights tangled across the gutters, wreaths hung with precision. Perfect. Controlled. I stood on the porch for a moment, gloved hand hovering over the brass knocker. Then I pressed it, the hollow thud echoing inside. My brother opened the door, his face tight, his smile forced. "You came," he said. "Of course," I replied calmly. "You invited me." Inside, the house was as polished as ever. The smell of ham and cloves filled the air, mingling with pine from the tree in the corner. My sister-in-law hovered by the kitchen doorway, her eyes flicking nervously toward me, then away again. My mother sat at the dining table, already dressed in her holiday red sweater, her lips pursed. "Sit," she said, gesturing stiffly toward a chair. I glanced at the table. Every chair filled except one. My seat. For years that space had been denied me. Tonight it waited. I walked to it slowly, the room heavy with silence. As I pulled the chair back, the wood scraped against the polished floor. My heart should have pounded. My hands should have shaken. But they didn't. I sat. And for the first time in decades, I felt taller than the table itself. Dinner began stiffly. Forks scraped plates, glasses clinked softly. My family spoke in careful tones, their eyes darting toward me, then away. I let them stew in it. I let them feel every ounce of discomfort they had earned. At one point, my mother cleared her throat. Your dinner looked lovely," she said, the words dragging out as if each one weighed a stone. I sipped my wine, meeting her gaze. It was. Silence followed, broken only by the ticking clock on the wall. Finally, my brother's wife blurted, "Everyone saw it." The photos caused a lot of questions. I leaned forward slightly, folding my hands on the table. "And what answers did you give?" No one spoke. I let the moment stretch, the tension rising like smoke. Then, softly, I opened my purse and slid the leather-bound guest book onto the table. My mother's eyes widened. My brother frowned. "What's that?" he asked. "Proof," I said calmly. I opened it to the fresh pages, the 32 names written in bold ink. "These are the people who showed up. The ones who said yes when you said no." The room went still. My mother's hand trembled against her napkin. "You humiliated us," she whispered. "No," I replied, my voice steady. "I showed the truth. You didn't want me at your table. So I built one of my own." The silence broke then, voices rising in protest, excuses tumbling over each other. "It wasn't personal. We didn't mean. You're twisting this." I let them speak, each word digging their hole deeper. Then I closed the book with a sharp snap. "You tried to erase me," I said, my voice cutting through their noise. "But the world saw me. And now, no matter how you spin it, no matter what story you tell, everyone knows exactly who you are." Their faces paled. My brother pushed back his chair, but my mother stayed frozen, her eyes locked on mine. And for once she had no words. I finished my meal in silence, savoring each bite as though it were the last supper I would ever need from them. When my plate was clean, I folded my napkin neatly and placed it on the table. Then I stood, slipping the guest book back into my purse. "Thank you for the invitation," I said evenly. "But I have a table now. My own table. And it will always be fuller than this one." No one stopped me as I walked to the door. No one dared. Outside, the snow crunched beneath my boots. The air was sharp, biting, alive. I walked down the street, the house shrinking behind me, its glow dimming against the dark. And with each step I felt lighter. Stronger. Because revenge wasn't in slamming doors or shouting accusations. Revenge was in the quiet power of being seen when they wanted you invisible. It was in building something so undeniable that their erasure became their own shame. I had found my place at the table, not theirs but mine. And I would never give it up again. If this story gripped your heart, subscribe now for more dark, emotional tales of revenge and betrayal. Your next unforgettable story begins here.